The morning sun had barely crested the Arizona Territory hills when Thomas Reed spotted the young woman sitting beside the creek, her fingers moving with such impossible speed and precision that he reined in his horse just to watch her work. It was the spring of 1876, and he had been riding fence lines for the Triple Bar Ranch for 3 weeks straight. But nothing in all his days had captured his attention quite like the sight of those hands weaving willow branches into patterns so tight they seemed to defy the very laws of nature itself. Thomas dismounted slowly, careful not to startle her, though she must have heard his approach. She was Apache. He could tell from her dress and the traditional design taking shape beneath her fingers. And she worked with a concentration so complete that the world around her seemed to fade into nothing but those willow strips and the water flowing past her feet. He had seen plenty of baskets in his 24 years, had even watched his own mother weave simple reed containers back in Missouri, but this was something entirely different. This was artistry that bordered on magic. "Morning, miss," he called out softly, keeping a respectful distance. The last thing he wanted was to frighten her or interrupt something that clearly required such focus. She looked up then, and Thomas felt his breath catch in his throat. Her eyes were the deepest brown he had ever seen, framed by high cheekbones and a face that held both strength and an unexpected gentleness. She could not have been more than 22 or 23, he guessed, and there was a wariness in her expression that told him she had learned to be careful around white men, especially cowboys who rode alone through Apache lands. "Good morning," she replied in perfect English, her voice melodic despite its caution. "You are far from the ranch boundaries." Thomas glanced down at his boots, suddenly feeling like he had intruded on something sacred. "I reckon I am," was checking the eastern fence line and saw the creek. Horse needed water. It was partly true, though he had to admit to himself that curiosity had played just as large a role in his detour. She studied him for a long moment, then returned her attention to the basket in her lap. Her fingers resumed their quick, precise movements, pulling willow strips through gaps so small Thomas could barely see them, creating a spiral pattern that climbed the sides of what was clearly going to be a water vessel. He had heard stories about Apache baskets so tightly woven they could hold water without a single drop leaking through, but he had always assumed such tales were exaggerations, the kind of frontier legends that grew taller with each telling. "May I watch?" he asked, surprising himself with his boldness. "I have never seen anything like what you are doing." She paused again, her dark eyes assessing him with an intelligence that made Thomas stand a little straighter. "You may watch from where you stand," she said finally, "but do not come closer. My grandmother taught me these patterns, and they are not for men to learn." Thomas nodded quickly, grateful for even this small permission. He settled himself against a nearby cottonwood tree, letting his horse drink from the creek while he observed the young woman's work. The basket was already nearly a foot tall, its sides curving gently inward before flaring out again at what would become the rim. The willow strips were so thin and flexible that they bent without breaking, and she wove them in patterns that changed subtly as the basket grew, creating designs that seemed to flow like water itself. "My name is Thomas Reed," he offered after several minutes of companionable silence. "I have been working for the Triple Bar since last autumn." "I know who you are," she replied without looking up. "You are the cowboy who stopped Diego Martinez from beating his horse last month. You bought the animal from him and gave it to the widow Sanchez so her son could work the fields." Thomas felt heat rise in his cheeks. He had not realized that act of basic decency had been noticed by anyone outside the small town of Copper Springs. "That horse did not deserve such treatment," he said simply, "and the boy needed help." "You are kinder than most of your kind," she said, and there was something in her voice that suggested this observation both pleased and troubled her. "My name is Aiyana. It means eternal blossom in my language." "That is a beautiful name," Thomas said, meaning it completely. "And I have to say, I have never seen anyone create something so perfect. How long have you been learning this skill? Aiyana's fingers never stopped moving as she spoke. Since I was 6 years old. My grandmother, Nasha, is the finest basket weaver in 3 territories. She learned from her grandmother, who learned from hers, going back more generations than we can count. Each woman adds her own patterns, her own understanding, but the basic technique is ancient. These baskets must hold water without leaking even a single drop, or they are considered failures. Thomas watched in amazement as she selected a new willow strip from the pile beside her, softening it briefly in her mouth before weaving it seamlessly into the existing pattern. The transition was so smooth, he could not even see where the old strip ended and the new one began. "And do your baskets ever leak?" he asked. For the first time, a small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Never," she said with quiet pride. "I have been weaving watertight baskets since I was 12 years old. My grandmother says I have the gift, that my fingers understand what my mind has not yet learned." They fell into silence again, but it was a comfortable quiet, broken only by the soft sounds of the creek and the occasional snort from Thomas's horse. The sun climbed higher, and Thomas knew he should return to his work, but he found himself unable to leave. There was something mesmerizing about watching Aiyana work, something that went beyond mere curiosity about her technique. She moved with a grace that seemed effortless, her entire being focused on the creation taking shape in her hands. "Why do you sit here by the creek instead of in your village?" Thomas asked finally. "Seems like it would be easier to work at home." Aiyana's expression grew more serious. "The willow must be fresh and flexible," she explained. "I cut it this morning from the trees upstream, and I must keep it damp as I work or it will become brittle and break. Also, the sound of the water helps me concentrate. My grandmother says we weave the spirit of the water into our baskets, and that is why they can hold it without letting it escape." Thomas considered this, finding a poetry in her words that touched something deep inside him. He had grown up in a practical world where things either worked or they did not, where results mattered more than methods. But listening to Aiyana speak about her craft, he understood that there was more to this skill than simple technique. There was tradition, spirituality, and a connection to the natural world that his own culture had largely forgotten in its rush westward. "Would you teach me?" The words were out before Thomas could stop them, and he immediately worried he had overstepped. But Aiyana only looked at him with those penetrating dark eyes, seeming to see straight through to his intentions. "Why would a cowboy want to learn Apache basket weaving?" she asked, not unkindly but with genuine curiosity. Thomas thought about this carefully before answering. "Because it is beautiful," he said finally. "Because it is a skill that matters, that creates something useful and lasting. Because I am tired of only knowing how to mend fences and rope cattle. Because—" He paused, then decided to speak the full truth. "Because I would like a reason to see you again." Aiyana's eyes widened slightly at this admission, and Thomas worried he had been too forward. But then that small smile returned, warming her features in a way that made his heart beat faster. "You are honest," she said. "That is rare in a white man, but I cannot teach you the sacred patterns. They are for Apache women only, passed down through the female line." "I understand," Thomas said quickly, trying to hide his disappointment. "I meant no disrespect." "However," Aiyana continued, her smile growing slightly, "I suppose you could learn the basic techniques. How to select and prepare willow, how to begin the spiral, how to maintain tension. These things are not secret, and my grandmother has been saying I should practice explaining my work. She says the best weavers can teach as well as create." Hope flared in Thomas's chest. "I would be grateful for any knowledge you are willing to share," he said. "I could come back tomorrow morning before my work begins, if that would suit you." Aiyana studied him for another long moment, and Thomas had the distinct impression he was being judged by standards he did not fully understand. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her, because she nodded slowly. "Tomorrow morning, when the sun is at this same angle. Bring a sharp knife and wear gloves, The willow can cut your hands if you are not careful." Thomas felt a grin spread across his face that he could not have suppressed if he tried. "I will be here," he promised. "And thank you, Aiyana, truly." She ducked her head slightly, returning her attention to her weaving. "Go now. Your horse is getting restless, and I must finish this basket before the afternoon heat makes the willow too dry." Thomas mounted up, but before he rode away, he turned back one more time. "That basket you are making. It is really something special. I marvel at your skill, I really do." Aiyana looked up, and the smile she gave him then was like the sun breaking through clouds. "Tomorrow you will understand why it is special," she said. "Today you only see, tomorrow you will begin to learn." Thomas rode back toward the triple bar with his mind spinning. He had come west to escape the confines of his father's Missouri farm, to find freedom in the wide, open spaces of the territory. He had found work that suited him and a land that challenged him, but he had not expected to find someone who made him want to learn things he had never imagined caring about. Aiyana was unlike any woman he had ever met, and the basket weaving was unlike any skill he had ever witnessed. The combination left him feeling like he had stumbled onto something important, though he could not yet put a name to what that something might be. That evening, back at the ranch house, Thomas barely heard the other cowboys talking about the upcoming cattle drive to Tucson. His mind kept returning to the creek, to the sight of those quick, clever fingers creating magic from simple willow branches. He cleaned his best gloves and sharpened his pocket knife, then lay awake far too long thinking about the morning to come. True to his word, Thomas arrived at the creek just as the sun reached the angle Aiyana had specified. She was already there, and she had brought supplies for him. Fresh willow branches, stripped of their bark and sorted by thickness. A pile of dried grass for practicing the initial spiral. And a patience in her expression that suggested she had decided he was worth the effort of teaching. "First, you must learn to see the willow not as wood but as thread," Aiyana began, holding up one of the thin branches. "It must be flexible like thread, strong like thread, and it must bend without breaking. Feel this one. Tell me if it is ready to weave." Thomas took the branch she offered, running it between his fingers as he had seen her do. It felt smooth and slightly damp, pliable when he bent it gently. "It seems ready to me," he said uncertainly. Aiyana shook her head. "Too dry. See how it wants to spring back when you release it. That means it will fight you as you weave, and fighting materials always results in weakness. Wait." She walked to the creek and submerged the branch for several seconds, then brought it back. "Now try." This time, when Thomas bent the willow, it curved smoothly and held its shape. "I see the difference," he said, fascinated. "It has to be damp enough to be cooperative." "Exactly," Aiyana said, approval in her voice. "This is the first lesson. You must work with the materials, not against them. The willow wants to bend, wants to weave. Your job is to guide it, not force it." For the next hour, Aiyana showed Thomas how to begin the spiral base of a basket. It was far more difficult than it looked. The initial strands had to be arranged in a star pattern, then the weaving strand had to wrap around them in an ever-widening spiral, maintaining perfect tension throughout. Too loose and the base would be weak. Too tight and the willow would snap. Thomas's first attempt fell apart almost immediately. His second was lopsided. His third showed promise until he pulled too hard and broke the weaving strand, but Aiyana never showed impatience. She simply corrected his mistakes, showed him the proper technique again, and encouraged him to try once more. "You are learning," she said after his fourth attempt produced something that actually resembled the beginning of a basket base. "Your hands are too used to rough work, to pulling tight on rope and leather. You must teach them gentleness." "How long did it take you to master this?" Thomas asked, flexing his fingers which were already sore from the unfamiliar work. "I am still mastering it," Aiyana replied seriously. "My grandmother says she learns something new with every basket, even after 60 years of weaving. The patterns are ancient, but each basket is unique. Each one teaches something if you are willing to listen." Thomas found himself captivated not just by the basket weaving but by the philosophy behind it. Aiyana spoke about her work with a reverence that made him see it as more than simple craft. It was meditation, art, prayer, and practical skill all woven together as tightly as the willow strands themselves. As the sun climbed higher, Aiyana returned to her own work while Thomas continued practicing his base spiral. She was starting a new basket today, and he watched in awe as her practiced hands created in minutes what would have taken him hours to accomplish. The willow seemed to flow through her fingers like water, each strand finding its perfect place as if by instinct rather than conscious thought. "May I ask you something personal?" Thomas ventured after a while. Aiyana glanced up from her work. "You may ask, I may choose not to answer." "Why did you agree to teach me? I am a stranger and a white man at that. You could have sent me away yesterday and thought nothing more of it." Aiyana's hands stilled, and she looked out across the creek toward the distant hills. "My grandmother says the old ways are dying," she said softly. "Every year, fewer young women learn to weave the water baskets. They go to the reservation schools, learn English and sewing and cooking like white women. They forget the patterns, forget the songs we sing while we work. Grandmother says that skills shared do not die, even if they are shared with outsiders. She says perhaps the white world needs to remember that some things cannot be rushed, cannot be made by machines, can only be created by human hands and human patience." Thomas absorbed this, understanding the weight of what Aiyana was really saying. "You are trying to preserve something precious," he said, "and I am honored to be trusted with even a small part of it. Also," Aiyana added with a slight smile, "you have kind eyes, and you stopped that man from beating his horse. Anyone who shows compassion to animals might be worthy of learning compassion for materials." They worked in companionable silence after that, and Thomas found himself falling into a rhythm with the willow that surprised him. His fingers were clumsy and his tension was uneven, but there was something deeply satisfying about the work. Each strand that found its place felt like a small victory, and he began to understand what Aiyana meant about listening to the materials. When the sun indicated it was time for Thomas to head to work, Aiyana examined his practice base with a critical but not unkind eye. "You have patience," she pronounced. "That is good. Tomorrow we will work on building up the sides. Bring this base with you and keep it damp. Wrap it in wet cloth tonight." "I will," Thomas promised. "And Aiyana, thank you again. This means more to me than you might realize." "I realize more than you think," she replied, meeting his eyes with that direct gaze that always made his heart skip. "Go now. Do not be late to your work because of me." Thomas rode toward the triple bar feeling like he was carrying something precious, though all he had was a lumpy, uneven spiral of willow that any experienced weaver would have discarded. But it represented his first step into a world he had never imagined entering, and it was a connection to a remarkable young woman who fascinated him more with each passing hour. The days fell into a pattern after that. Each morning before dawn, Thomas would ride to the creek where Aiyana would be waiting with fresh willow and endless patience. She taught him how to build up the sides of a basket, how to change the weave pattern to create strength in different areas, how to finish the rim so it would not unravel. She taught him the names of different basket styles in her language, the purposes each shape served, and the meanings behind the decorative patterns she wove into her finest work. But they did not only talk about basket weaving. As the days turned into weeks, Thomas and Aiyana began to share their stories with each other. He told her about growing up in Missouri, about his mother who had died when he was 16, about his father who had wanted him to take over the farm, but could not understand Thomas's need to see what lay beyond the familiar fields. She told him about her childhood in the Apache camps, about learning to weave beside her grandmother, about the hardships that had come as white settlers pushed further into Apache lands. "My people have lived in these hills for more generations than anyone can count," Aiyana said one morning as they worked side by side. We knew every spring, every game trail, every plant that could heal or feed. Now we are told we must live in designated areas, must give up our old ways. My father is angry always. He says we should fight, should resist. But my grandmother says that fighting is not the only form of resistance. She says keeping our knowledge alive, teaching our skills, remembering our stories, these things are also resistance. Thomas looked at the basket taking shape in his own hands, still clumsy compared to Aiyana's work but infinitely better than his first attempts. She is wise, your grandmother. I would like to meet her someday if that would be appropriate. Aiyana smiled. She already knows about you. I have told her about the cowboy who comes every morning to learn weaving. She says any man willing to wake before dawn to work with willow cannot be entirely bad, even if he is white. I am not sure whether to be flattered or insulted, Thomas said with a laugh. Be flattered, Aiyana replied. For my grandmother, that is high praise indeed. As May turned into June, Thomas found himself counting the hours until each morning's lesson. The basket weaving was endlessly fascinating, but he had to admit to himself that it was Aiyana herself who drew him back day after day. He loved the way she concentrated when working on a particularly difficult pattern, the tip of her tongue just visible between her lips. He loved the way she laughed when he made a mistake that resulted in a comically lopsided basket. He loved the way she spoke about her people and their traditions with fierce pride mixed with deep sadness for what was being lost. And if he was reading the signs correctly, Aiyana was beginning to care for him as well. She started arriving with extra food to share, saying her grandmother had cooked too much. She began teaching him words in her language beyond the names of basket techniques. And sometimes, when she corrected his hand position or showed him a particularly tricky weave, her touch would linger just a moment longer than strictly necessary. It was on a warm morning in late June that Thomas finally completed his first watertight basket. He had been working on it for 3 weeks, under Aiyana's careful guidance, and when he poured water into it from the creek, not a single drop leaked through. He looked up at Aiyana with undisguised joy, and she was beaming at him with such pride that he felt his chest might burst. You have done it, she said softly. A true water basket. My grandmother will not believe me when I tell her. Then bring her here tomorrow, Thomas said impulsively. Let me meet this woman who has taught you so much, and let her see with her own eyes that her teachings can bridge even the gap between our peoples. Aiyana's smile faltered slightly. You do not understand what you are asking. For her to come here to meet with you openly, it would require explanations. My father would want to know why. The other women in our camp would ask questions. Then I will come to your camp, Thomas said. I will speak to your father, ask his permission properly to continue learning from you and your grandmother. Aiyana, I do not want to hide these meetings as if we are doing something wrong. What you have taught me, what we have shared these past weeks, it is good and right, and I am not ashamed of it. Aiyana looked at him for a long moment, something complicated moving behind her dark eyes. You do not know what you are saying. A white cowboy asking to court an Apache woman, that is how my father will see it, and he will not approve. He tolerates me teaching you weaving because it happens out here, away from the camp, where he does not have to acknowledge it. But if you come there, if you make it official, everything will change. Thomas set down his finished basket and moved closer to Aiyana, though he was careful not to touch her without permission. And if I do want to court you, he asked quietly, would that be so terrible? These past weeks with you have been the best of my life. I wake up excited for dawn because it means I get to see you. I go to sleep thinking about the things you said, the way you laugh, the way the sunlight catches in your hair when you are concentrating on a difficult pattern. Thomas. Aiyana began, but her voice was uncertain rather than dismissive. I know we come from different worlds, Thomas continued. I know there are people on both sides who will object, but I also know that what I feel for you is real, and I think maybe you feel something for me too. Tell me I am wrong and I will never speak of it again, but if I am right, Then we owe it to ourselves to be honest about it. Aiyana was quiet for so long that Thomas feared he had ruined everything. But then she reached out and took his hand, her calloused fingers intertwining with his. "You are not wrong," she whispered. "I tried to tell myself it was foolish, that nothing good could come of caring for you, but my heart did not listen to my head. Every morning I tell myself I should stop these lessons, should stay away from the creek. And every morning I come anyway because the thought of not seeing you is worse than the thought of whatever troubles may come." Thomas felt like he could barely breathe. "Then let me do this properly. Let me speak to your father, show him I am serious in my intentions. I am not a wealthy man, but I am honest and hardworking. I would treat you with the respect and love you deserve." "He will test you," Aiyana warned. "He will not make it easy, and even if he agrees, the others at the ranch, they will not understand. You could lose your position, your standing in the white community." "Then I will find other work," Thomas said simply. "Aiyana, I did not come west to live a safe, easy life. I came to find something worth fighting for. I think maybe I have found it." Aiyana's eyes were bright with unshed tears, but she was smiling. "You are either very brave or very foolish. I am not sure which." "Perhaps both," Thomas admitted. "But I am certain, if you will have me, I want to court you properly with your family's knowledge and blessing." "Then come to our camp 3 days from now in the late afternoon," Aiyana said. "I will prepare my father. I cannot promise he will be welcoming, but I can promise he will listen. And my grandmother will be your ally. She has been hoping for this, I think." The next 3 days were the longest of Thomas's life. He worked his usual duties at the Triple Bar, but his mind was elsewhere, rehearsing what he would say to Aiyana's father, imagining all the ways the meeting could go wrong. He confided in Jake Morrison, the oldest cowhand on the ranch and the closest thing he had to a friend. Jake whistled low when Thomas told him about Aiyana. "You are playing with fire, son. Feelings between the Apache and white folks around here run hot on both sides. And the boss, he is not going to be happy if he finds out one of his men is courting an Apache girl." "That is my concern to manage," Thomas said firmly. "I am not asking for approval, Jake. I am just telling you in case things go badly and I need someone to know where I am." Jake studied him with knowing eyes. "You really care for this girl, do not you?" "I do," Thomas said simply. "More than I have ever cared for anyone." "Then I hope her father is more open-minded than most," Jake said, clapping him on the shoulder. "And for what it is worth, I think you are doing the right thing. Honesty is always better than sneaking around, even when it is harder." On the appointed afternoon, Thomas rode toward the Apache camp with his heart pounding so hard he was sure his horse could feel it. Aiyana had given him careful directions, and as he approached the cluster of traditional dwellings nestled in a protected valley, he saw people stopping their activities to watch him. A white man riding alone into an Apache camp was unusual enough to draw attention, and he could feel the weight of suspicious stares from every direction. Aiyana emerged from one of the larger structures and walked toward him with her head held high. She was dressed in traditional clothing more elaborate than her usual work dress, and her hair was intricately braided with small shells woven into the strands. She looked beautiful and regal, and Thomas felt a surge of pride that this remarkable woman had chosen to care for him. "My father is inside," she said quietly as Thomas dismounted. "He has agreed to hear you, but he is not pleased. Be respectful but strong. He does not respect weakness." Thomas nodded, straightening his vest and checking that his hat was properly positioned. "I am ready." Aiyana led him into the dwelling where an older man sat cross-legged near a small fire. He had the bearing of a warrior despite what Thomas guessed to be 50 or more years, and his face was stern as he watched Thomas enter. Beside him sat an elderly woman with kind eyes and hands that bore the marks of a lifetime of weaving. This could only be Nasha, Aiyana's grandmother. Thomas removed his hat and stood respectfully just inside the entrance. Aiyana spoke to her father in Apache, and though Thomas did not understand the words, he heard his name and Aiyana's intertwined in her explanation. When she finished, Her father gestured for Thomas to sit. "My daughter says you wish to court her," he said in heavily accented English. "Why would I allow a white man to court my daughter? Your people have brought us nothing but broken promises and stolen land." Thomas took a deep breath, knowing this was his one chance to make his case. "You are right to be angry about the injustices your people have suffered. I cannot undo the wrongs that have been done, and I will not insult you by pretending otherwise. But I can promise that I see your daughter not as a white man sees a conquest, but as a man sees a woman he hopes to spend his life with. She has taught me skills I never knew existed. She has opened my eyes to ways of thinking about the world that my own culture has forgotten. I respect her, I admire her, and I love her." The silence that followed was deafening. Aiyana's father studied Thomas with eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. Finally, he spoke again. "Love is cheap. Words are cheap. What can you offer my daughter besides pretty speeches?" "Honesty," Thomas said immediately. "Loyalty, a willingness to learn from her and her people. I know I cannot give her wealth or a grand house. But I can give her my whole heart, and I can promise to honor her traditions as well as share my own. I will not ask her to give up who she is to be with me." Nasha spoke then, her voice soft but commanding. She spoke in Apache, and Thomas watched as Aiyana's father's expression shifted from stern to thoughtful. The old woman gestured toward Thomas several times, and once she held up her hands and mimicked the motion of weaving, which made Aiyana's father raise his eyebrows. After a lengthy exchange, the father turned back to Thomas. "My mother says you have learned to weave water baskets. She says only someone with patience and respect for our ways could master this skill. She says the water spirits have accepted you, and we should do the same." Hope flared in Thomas's chest, but he kept his expression neutral, waiting. "I am not so easily convinced as my mother," the father continued, "but I am willing to allow you to prove yourself. You may court my daughter for 3 months. In that time, you will demonstrate that you can provide for her, that you can be trusted, and that your feelings are genuine and lasting. At the end of 3 months, if Aiyana still wishes to bind herself to you, and if you have proven yourself worthy, I will give my blessing. But know this, white cowboy, if you bring shame or harm to my daughter, there is nowhere in this territory you can hide from my anger." "I understand and accept your terms," Thomas said, meeting the older man's fierce gaze without flinching. "You will not regret giving me this chance." Aiyana's father grunted, which Thomas chose to interpret as grudging acceptance. Nasha, however, smiled broadly and said something to Aiyana that made the younger woman blush and smile. Then the old woman beckoned Thomas closer and took his hands in hers, examining his palms and fingers with the eye of a master craftsman. She spoke rapidly in Apache, and Aiyana translated. "She says your hands have learned well. She says the calluses of weaving are beginning to join the calluses of rope work, and this is good. She says a man who can create as well as labor will make a good husband." Thomas felt warmth spread through his chest at the old woman's approval. "Please tell her that she is a master teacher, and that I am honored to have learned from her granddaughter, who carries on her skills with great talent." When Aiyana translated this, Nasha's smile grew even wider, and she patted Thomas's hands approvingly before releasing them. She spoke again, and this time Aiyana laughed as she translated. "She says you have learned flattery as well as weaving, and that you are not as simple as you look." Despite the tension of the moment, Thomas found himself laughing too. "Your grandmother is wise in all things, I see." The meeting concluded with instructions from Aiyana's father about the proper conduct of courtship. Thomas could visit the camp twice weekly in the evenings. He could speak with Aiyana only in the presence of others. He was expected to bring offerings of food or useful goods on each visit to demonstrate his ability to provide. And he was absolutely forbidden from touching Aiyana inappropriately or attempting to be alone with her. Thomas agreed to every condition without hesitation. As he prepared to leave, Aiyana walked him back to his horse, her eyes shining with happiness despite the careful distance she maintained between them. He said yes, she whispered, as if she could not quite believe it. I was certain he would refuse outright. Your grandmother is a formidable advocate, Thomas replied, equally quietly. Though I meant every word I said, I will prove myself worthy of you, Aiyana, I promise you that. I know you will, she said softly. 3 months seems like a very long time right now. Then we will fill it with moments that matter, Thomas said. I will see you tomorrow morning at the creek, Aiyana nodded. Tomorrow and every morning, though now we weave not just baskets but a future together. Thomas rowed back to the triple bar feeling like he was floating. The hard part was done. He had faced Aiyana's father and survived. He had been given a chance to prove himself. Now all he had to do was not mess it up. The next morning, Thomas arrived at the creek before dawn with renewed purpose. He had spent half the night working on a new basket, determined to create something perfect enough to give to Nasha as a thank-you gift. Aiyana smiled when she saw what he was working on. It is beautiful, she said, examining his work. Your weaving has improved so much. The tension is even, the pattern is clean. Grandmother will treasure this. I hope so, Thomas said. She took a risk speaking on my behalf. I want her to know I appreciate it. They worked in companionable silence for a while, but there was a new awareness between them now, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing for weeks, but were only now spoken aloud. Thomas found himself hyper-aware of Aiyana's presence, of the sound of her breathing, of the way she hummed softly while she worked. Tell me about your dreams, Aiyana said suddenly. Not your dreams for us, but your dreams for yourself. What did you hope to find when you came west? Thomas considered this carefully as his fingers continued their weaving. I think I hope to find purpose, he said finally. On the farm in Missouri, I was just following the path laid out by my father and his father before him. It was a good life, but it was not my life. I wanted to discover what I was capable of when I had to rely on my own skills and decisions. I wanted to feel like I was building something of my own, not just maintaining what others had built. And have you found what you were looking for? Aiyana asked. More than I ever imagined, Thomas said, meeting her eyes. I found work that challenges me, land that inspires me, and you. You have shown me that there are so many more ways to build a life than I ever knew existed. Before I met you, I thought the only valuable skills were the ones that could be measured in dollars or cattle. Now I understand that creating something beautiful, preserving knowledge, honoring tradition, these things have value beyond measure. Aiyana ducked her head, but he could see she was pleased. You are learning to think like an Apache, she said. We measure wealth differently than white people do. A man who can make things with his hands, who knows the stories of his people, who treats others with respect. This man is wealthy even if he has no money. A man with many horses but no honor is poor no matter what he owns. I like that way of thinking, Thomas said. Though I confess I would like to have enough money to give you a comfortable life. Not a fancy life necessarily, but one where you do not have to worry about having enough. My needs are simple, Aiyana assured him. Food, shelter, the materials for weaving, and people I love around me. These things make me happy. I do not need silk dresses or big houses. Over the following weeks, Thomas threw himself into proving his worth to Aiyana and her family. He visited the camp twice weekly as permitted, bringing gifts of fresh meat from successful hunts, flour and sugar from town, bolts of fabric that Aiyana's mother could use for sewing. He sat with the men of the camp and listened to their stories, learning their names and their histories. He played with the children, teaching them rope tricks and learning their games in return. Slowly, grudgingly, Aiyana's father began to soften toward him. Thomas made a point of asking the older man's advice on tracking and horsemanship, showing genuine respect for his knowledge. And when a group of drunk cowboys from a neighboring ranch rode too close to the Apache camp one evening making trouble, Thomas placed himself between them and the camp, talking them down and convincing them to leave peacefully. That night, Aiyana's father actually smiled at Thomas for the first time. You stood with us against your own kind, he said. That took courage. They were not my kind, Thomas replied firmly. Drunken bullies looking to cause trouble are not my kind, no matter what color their skin is. My kind are people who treat others with dignity, who honor their word, who protect those who need protecting. People like you and your family. It was after this incident that the restrictions on his time with Aiyana began to relax slightly. They were allowed to walk together around the camp, still in view of others but no longer required to have someone sitting directly beside them. They were allowed to take meals together, sitting close enough that their shoulders occasionally brushed. The attraction between them had been building for months now, and the small touches permitted by courtship were simultaneously wonderful and torturous. Thomas longed to take Aiyana in his arms, to kiss her, to hold her close. But he respected the boundaries set by her father and by her culture, knowing that proving his ability to control himself was part of proving his worthiness. One evening in early September, nearly 2 months into their formal courtship, Nasha invited Thomas to sit with her while she worked on an elaborate basket. Through Aiyana's translation, the old woman told him stories about the ancient basket weavers, about patterns that held prayers, about baskets so sacred they could only be made for certain ceremonies. My grandmother wants to know if you still practice your weaving, Aiyana translated. She says many men learn skills to impress a woman, then abandon them once they have won her. Thomas shook his head emphatically. I weave every day, not as well as either of you, but I am improving. I find it helps me think, helps me solve problems. When my mind is tangled with worries, sitting down with Willow and working through a pattern helps me see things more clearly. Nasha nodded approvingly when this was translated. She spoke at length, and Aiyana's eyes grew wide as she listened. Grandmother says she wants to teach you the water blessing pattern. It is not a sacred pattern, but it is a special one, reserved for baskets that will be given as wedding gifts. She says if you are to marry me, you should know how to weave a proper water basket for our home. Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion. Please tell her I would be deeply honored to learn any pattern she wishes to teach me. What followed was one of the most intense learning sessions Thomas had ever experienced. Nasha was exacting in her instruction, accepting nothing less than perfection. The water blessing pattern involved creating subtle variations in the weave that formed symbols for water, life, and continuity. Each symbol had to be placed precisely, and the transitions between them had to be seamless. Thomas worked until his fingers ached and his eyes strained in the firelight, but he refused to give up. Nasha would undo sections that were not quite right, showing him again and again until he mastered each element. Aiyana sat beside them, offering encouragement and clarification, her pride in him evident even as she pushed him to do better. Finally, near midnight, Nasha examined his work and nodded. She spoke, and Aiyana translated with a tremulous smile. She says it is good. She says you have learned not just the pattern but the purpose behind it. She says any basket you weave with this pattern will hold not just water but blessing for your household. Thomas looked at the old woman, this master craftswoman who had accepted him despite every reason she had to reject him, and he felt profound gratitude. Thank you, he said, speaking directly to her even though he knew she understood little English. Thank you for seeing past what I am to who I am trying to become. Nasher reached out and patted his cheek with her weathered hand, speaking softly. She says you are already who you need to be, Aiyana translated, her voice thick with emotion. She says you have a good heart, and that is the most important thing. As September turned into October, Thomas felt the pressure of the approaching deadline. He had a little over a month left to prove himself worthy of marrying Aiyana, and while he believed he had made good progress, he knew her father was not easily convinced. He needed something more, some way to demonstrate that he could provide a real future for Aiyana. The solution came from an unexpected source. One evening at the Triple Bar, the ranch owner, Charles Henderson, called Thomas into his office. Thomas went with trepidation, wondering if his courtship of Aiyana had finally come to Henderson's attention in a negative way. Instead, Henderson offered him a promotion. "You are a good worker, Reed, and the men respect you. I want to put you in charge of the northern grazing lands. It comes with a cabin on the property and a significant increase in wages. You would have men working under you, and you would be responsible for the herd in that sector." Thomas could hardly believe his luck. "Sir, I am honored, but I need to be honest with you about something before I accept." Henderson raised an eyebrow. "Go on." Thomas took a deep breath. "I am courting an Apache woman. I intend to marry her if her father gives his blessing. If that is going to be a problem for you, I would rather know now than accept a position I might not be able to keep." Henderson was quiet for a long moment, studying Thomas with an unreadable expression. Finally, he spoke. "I will be honest with you, Reed. Some of the other ranchers would have a problem with it, but I am not some of the other ranchers. I care about two things. Can a man do his job, and does he conduct himself with integrity? You have proven you can do both. Who you marry is your own business as long as it does not interfere with your work." Relief flooded through Thomas. "It will not interfere, sir. You have my word." "Then the position is yours if you want it. You can move into the cabin at the end of the month. It needs some work, but it is solid and it has good land around it. Your woman likes to weave baskets, you said. There is a creek nearby with plenty of willow." Thomas felt like laughing with joy. "Mr. Henderson, you have just given me the means to build a real life. Thank you, sir. I will not let you down." That evening, Thomas rode straight to the Apache camp, barely able to contain his excitement. When he told Aiyana about the promotion and the cabin, she threw her arms around him in a spontaneous embrace that made both of them freeze, suddenly aware that they had never held each other before. Aiyana pulled back quickly, blushing, but she was smiling. "This is wonderful news. We must tell my father immediately." They found her father sitting with several other men, discussing the upcoming winter preparations. Thomas apologized for the interruption, but asked if he could speak privately with Aiyana's father. The older man nodded and followed them to a quieter area of the camp. Thomas explained about the promotion, about the cabin and the increased wages, about Henderson's acceptance of his relationship with Aiyana. "I know the 3 months are not yet complete," Thomas said. "But I wanted you to know that I now have the means to provide properly for your daughter. A home, steady income, and a position of responsibility. I believe I have proven my intentions are serious and lasting. I am formally asking for Aiyana's hand in marriage." Aiyana's father was silent for so long that Thomas began to fear rejection. But then the older man extended his hand in the white custom of shaking. "You have proven yourself a man of honor," he said gravely. "You have shown respect for our ways, courage in defending us, and patience in courting my daughter properly. You have my blessing to marry Aiyana if she will have you." Thomas turned to Aiyana, his heart in his throat. "Will you marry me? Will you share that cabin by the creek and build a life with me? I cannot promise perfection, but I can promise that I will love you with everything I am for all the days I have left." Aiyana's eyes were bright with tears, but she was smiling more radiantly than he had ever seen. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will marry you, Thomas Reed. You have my whole heart." Unable to help himself, Thomas pulled her into his arms again, holding her close while her father looked on with an expression that might have been approval or might have been resignation. Nasha appeared from somewhere, cackling with delight and saying something that made Aiyana laugh even as happy tears streamed down her face. The next weeks were a whirlwind of preparation. A wedding was planned for early November, to be held at the Apache camp with both native and white traditions blended together. Thomas invited his friends from the ranch and was pleased when Henderson himself said he would attend. Jake Morrison offered to stand up with Thomas, and Aiyana's younger sister would stand with her. Thomas spent every spare moment working on the cabin, fixing the roof, replacing broken windows, building furniture from rough lumber. Aiyana came to see it one afternoon, bringing her grandmother, and both women pronounced it a good space with strong energy. Nasha immediately identified the best location for a weaving area where the light would be good and the space would be protected from drafts. "She says we will need many baskets," Aiyana translated with a laugh. "She says a home without baskets is like a body without a soul." Thomas kissed Aiyana's forehead, a liberty he now allowed himself occasionally. "Then we will fill it with baskets. Yours, mine, your grandmother's, we will have the finest collection in the territory." The wedding took place on a clear November morning with the aspens turning gold on the hillsides. Aiyana wore a dress that combined Apache and white elements, traditional in cut but made from fine fabric Thomas had bought in Tucson. She had woven flowers into her hair, and she was so beautiful that Thomas felt his eyes burn with tears when he first saw her. The ceremony itself was conducted by both an Apache elder and a traveling preacher who happened to be passing through Copper Springs. Vows were exchanged in both languages, rings were blessed by both traditions, and when Thomas was finally allowed to kiss his bride, he did so with a tenderness that made even some of the hardened cowboys smile. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, with food from both cultures, music from both traditions, and a joining of peoples that felt significant beyond just this one union. Thomas saw Henderson talking seriously with Aiyana's father, saw Jake Morrison teaching Apache children to rope a fence post, saw Nasha showing some of the ranch wives the basics of basket weaving. As the sun set and the fire burned bright, Thomas and Aiyana slipped away to begin their journey to their new home. The cabin was small and simple, but they had filled it with everything they needed: basic furniture, cooking supplies, and yes, many baskets. Nasha had insisted on giving them a dozen of her finest works, including an enormous water basket decorated with the blessing pattern Thomas had learned. That night, lying in their own bed in their own home, Aiyana curled against Thomas's side with a contentment that needed no words. "Are you happy?" she asked softly. "Happier than I knew it was possible to be," Thomas replied honestly. 6 months ago I was just a cowboy checking fence lines. Now I am married to the most remarkable woman I have ever known, living in a home we will build together, learning skills I never imagined I would care about. You have changed my entire life, Aiyana." "You have changed mine as well," she said. "I thought I would marry an Apache man, live in the traditional way, weave my baskets and raise my children as my mother and grandmother did. I never imagined I would fall in love with a white cowboy who would learn to weave water baskets and stand up to drunk riders and win over my entire family." Thomas held her closer. "I am the one who is blessed. You are a gift I did nothing to deserve." "We deserved each other," Aiyana corrected gently. "The spirits brought us together for a reason. You needed to learn patience and respect for ways different from your own. I needed to learn that not all white men are the same, that hearts can bridge cultures if they are open. Together we are stronger and wiser than either of us could be alone." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, and Thomas thought that no matter what challenges might come, they would face them together. Life in the cabin settled into a rhythm that satisfied them both. Thomas left early each morning to oversee the northern grazing lands, returning in the evening to find Aiyana working on her baskets or preparing dinner. She had transformed the cabin into a real home, with woven rugs on the floor, baskets of every size and purpose hanging from the walls and sitting on shelves, and touches of beauty in every corner. True to his word, Thomas continued his weaving practice. Most evenings, after the chores were done, he and Aiyana would sit together working on baskets while they talked about their days. He was nowhere near her skill level and probably never would be, but he had become competent enough that his baskets were functional and occasionally even attractive. "You should sell some of your work," Aiyana suggested one evening. "The women in town buy my baskets. They would buy yours too, especially if they knew a white man had learned to weave in the Apache style." Thomas considered this. "Would that offend your people?" A white man profiting from Apache techniques. Aiyana shook her head. My grandmother says knowledge shared grows stronger, not weaker. If you sell baskets, you are helping to spread appreciation for our methods, and the money would help us save for the future. So Thomas began bringing his better baskets to town, and Aiyana was right. The novelty of a cowboy who could weave Apache-style water baskets created considerable interest. Within a few months, he had a steady side income from his weaving, enough that they were able to save a considerable sum. The first winter of their marriage was cold but joyful. They kept the fire burning, worked on their crafts, and learned each other in the deep way that only time and proximity allow. Thomas continued to marvel at Aiyana's skill with willow and yucca and beargrass, watching her create baskets so fine they seemed more like fabric than woven plant material. How do you make them so perfect? He asked one snowy evening as she worked on an intricate ceremonial basket. Aiyana smiled. Years of practice, but also, I think, because I weave with love, not just love for you, though that is part of it. Love for the materials, for the patterns, for the tradition itself. When you work with love, the materials respond. They want to become their best selves. Thomas thought about his own weaving, which had improved dramatically since their marriage. I think you are right. My baskets are better now than they were before we married, and I think it is because I weave them thinking of you, of the home we are building, of the life we are creating together. Then your baskets are made with love too, Aiyana said, reaching over to squeeze his hand. And that is why they are strong and beautiful. Spring brought new challenges and new joys. Aiyana discovered she was pregnant in March, news that sent Thomas into a state of excited panic. He immediately began planning, building a cradle from carefully chosen wood, weaving tiny baskets for baby supplies, and generally worrying about everything that could possibly go wrong. You are worse than an old woman, Aiyana teased him. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I will be fine. But Thomas could not help himself. Aiyana was his entire world, and the thought of anything happening to her terrified him. He consulted with Nasha, who assured him that Aiyana was healthy and strong and from a line of women who birthed easily. He even spoke to the doctor in Copper Springs, who examined Aiyana and confirmed what Nasha had said. As spring turned to summer, Aiyana's belly grew, and Thomas found himself falling even more deeply in love with his wife. She was radiant in pregnancy, her skin glowing and her eyes bright. She continued weaving almost until the very end, creating small baskets perfect for a baby's needs. Their son was born on a hot July afternoon in 1877, with Nasha and Aiyana's mother attending the birth. Thomas waited outside, pacing and worrying, until he heard the healthy cry of a newborn. When he was finally allowed inside, Aiyana was propped up on their bed, holding a tiny bundle, and she was smiling with exhausted triumph. "Meet your son," she said softly. "He is perfect." Thomas approached reverently, looking down at the tiny face of his child. The baby had Aiyana's dark eyes and a shock of black hair, and Thomas fell in love instantly. "He is beautiful," he whispered. "You are amazing. I love you so much." They named the boy Samuel Tacoder Reed, combining Thomas's family name with an Apache name meaning friend to everyone. From the beginning, Sam was a happy baby, content to sleep in the woven cradle Thomas had made, to be carried in the traditional Apache cradleboard Nasha had crafted, to be surrounded by love from both sides of his heritage. Watching Aiyana with their son filled Thomas with a contentment he had not known existed. She was a natural mother, patient and attentive and full of songs and stories. She would weave with Sam sleeping in the cradleboard on her back, and Thomas would come home to find them like that, mother and child in perfect harmony. As Sam grew from baby to toddler, Thomas marveled at how completely the boy belonged to both worlds. He learned words in Apache and English simultaneously. He played with white children in town and Apache children in the camp. He watched his mother weave and his father work with cattle, absorbing everything with the endless curiosity of childhood. When Sam was 2, Aiyana became pregnant again. This time, Thomas was less panicked, having learned from the first experience that his wife was indeed strong and capable. Their daughter, Mary Kimmimler Reed, was born in the spring of 1879, and she proved to be as strong-willed and clever as her mother. Life settled into a beautiful pattern. Thomas continued to advance at the Triple Bar Ranch, eventually becoming Henderson's most trusted foreman. Aiyana's baskets had become sought after throughout the territory, with people willing to pay premium prices for her watertight vessels. Together, they had built a life that honored both their traditions, that raised children who belonged fully to both cultures, that demonstrated that love and respect could bridge any divide. On a warm evening in the summer of 1882, Thomas sat on the porch of their cabin watching Aiyana teach 7-year-old Sam the basics of basket weaving. 5-year-old Mary was playing nearby, singing to herself in a mixture of Apache and English. The sun was setting gold over the hills, and Thomas felt a peace so profound it was almost overwhelming. Aiyana looked up from her teaching and caught his eye, smiling in that way that still made his heart skip even after 6 years of marriage. "What are you thinking about?" she called. Thomas stood and walked over to his family, kneeling beside Sam to examine the boy's first attempts at weaving. "I am thinking about how lucky I am," he said honestly. "I am thinking about that first morning I saw you sitting by the creek, weaving baskets that held water without leaking. I marveled at your skill then, and I marvel at it still. But now I also marvel at your wisdom, your kindness, your strength as a mother and a wife. I marvel at the life we have built and the children we are raising. I marvel at the fact that every morning I wake up next to you is better than the one before." Aiyana's eyes were soft with love. "You learned to weave more than baskets," she said. "You learned to weave a life from different threads, to create something strong and beautiful from materials that others said could not be combined. That is the greatest skill of all." Sam looked up from his clumsy basket in progress. "Papa, look, I made the spiral just like Mama showed me." Thomas examined the work seriously. The spiral was uneven and the tension was inconsistent, but it was recognizable, and for a first attempt, it showed promise. "That is excellent work, son. Keep practicing, and one day your baskets will hold water without leaking, just like your mother's." "And your papa's," Aiyana added. "Do not let him pretend otherwise. His baskets are very good now." Mary ran over and climbed into Thomas's lap. "Tell us the story, Papa. Tell us about the cowboy and the basket weaver." It had become a family tradition, the story of how Thomas and Aiyana had met and fallen in love. The children never tired of hearing it, and Thomas never tired of telling it. So as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, he told the story once more, about a young cowboy who stopped to watch a young woman weaving by a creek, about patience and persistence and the bridging of two worlds, about baskets that held water and love that held strong through every challenge. As he talked, Aiyana continued teaching Sam the weaving techniques, her hands guiding his smaller ones in the ancient patterns. Mary fell asleep in Thomas's arms, and he held her close, marveling at the miracle of this life he had somehow been blessed enough to create. Years continued to pass in this golden way. Sam grew into a young man who was as comfortable on horseback as he was with weaving materials, who moved easily between white and Apache communities, who carried himself with quiet confidence. Mary became a skilled weaver like her mother, but also showed a talent for sketching and painting, creating art that blended the visual traditions of both cultures. In 1888, Thomas and Aiyana celebrated their 10th wedding anniversary with a gathering that brought together friends and family from every part of their lives. Henderson was there, now elderly but still sharp, telling anyone who would listen that hiring Thomas Reed was the best decision he had ever made. Jake Morrison came, bringing his own wife and children. Nasha presided over everything with regal contentment, now ancient but still weaving every day, her hands as steady as ever. Aiyana's father, who had long since made peace with his daughter's choice, stood and gave a speech in Apache that Aiyana translated for the white guests. "I was wrong to doubt this man," he said. "I thought no white cowboy could honor our ways or love our daughter as she deserved, but Thomas Reed proved me wrong through action, not words. He learned our skills, respected our traditions, and raised our grandchildren to be proud of both their heritages. He is proof that the color of a man's skin matters less than the size of his heart." Thomas felt tears sting his eyes at these words from the man who had once viewed him with such suspicion. He stood and responded, speaking first in English and then in the Apache he had learned over the years. "You gave me the greatest gift when you trusted me with your daughter. Aiyana has taught me that true wealth is not measured in cattle or money, but in skills shared, in traditions preserved, in children raised with love, in baskets woven with care. Every day I am grateful for the chance you gave me to prove myself worthy of her." That night, after everyone had left and their own children were asleep, Thomas and Aiyana sat together on their porch just as they had on countless nights before. He held one of the first baskets she had ever taught him to make, the spiral uneven and the weave loose by her standards, but still functional, still holding together after all these years. "I still have this," he said, showing her. "I could never bear to get rid of it." Aiyana took the basket and examined it fondly. "It is terrible," she said with a laugh, "but it represents something important, your willingness to learn, to be humble, to value skills you did not understand. That basket is worth more than the finest one I have ever woven because it represents the beginning of everything we have built." Thomas pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, feeling the solid warmth of her body against his. "I still marvel at you," he said quietly. "Every single day. The way you weave baskets that hold water without leaking, the way you weave a family together, the way you weave beauty and meaning into everything you touch. I will never stop marveling at you, Aiyana." She turned in his arms and kissed him with a tenderness that came from years of deep knowing. "And I marvel at you," she replied. "At the cowboy who stopped to watch instead of riding past, at the man who was willing to learn instead of dismissing what he did not understand. At the husband who loves me more with each passing year. At the father who teaches our children to value both their worlds. We are blessed, Thomas Reed, we are blessed beyond measure." They sat together in the darkness, listening to the creek that flowed near their home, the same creek where they had first met all those years ago. In the cabin behind them, their children slept peacefully. In the camp a few miles away, Nasha was probably weaving by lamplight even at her advanced age, unable to give up the craft that defined her. In the ranch house, Henderson was likely reviewing his accounts, pleased with the success of his northern operations under Thomas's management. All of it, every piece of this life, had started with baskets. With a young woman weaving by a creek and a cowboy who had the wisdom to stop and appreciate something beautiful. Thomas had learned to weave many things over the years: willow into baskets, cultures into family, differences into strength, moments into a lifetime of love. The summer of 1890 brought changes. Henderson passed away peacefully in his sleep, and to everyone's surprise, he left the northern section of the ranch, including Thomas and Aiyana's cabin and the surrounding land, directly to Thomas. The will stated simply, "To Thomas Reed, who proved that character matters more than background and who has been the best foreman and the best example of human decency I have known." This unexpected inheritance meant that Thomas and Aiyana now owned their land outright, a security they had not dared hope for. It meant they could expand, could dream bigger, could create something lasting to pass to their children and grandchildren. They decided to build a larger house, one that would accommodate their growing family and also serve as a space for teaching. Aiyana had long dreamed of formally teaching basket weaving to anyone who wanted to learn, preserving the techniques for future generations. Thomas designed the house to include a large, well-lit workshop area where multiple students could work comfortably. The new house was completed by the spring of 1891, and Aiyana began offering weaving classes that attracted students from across the territory. Some were Apache women wanting to learn the traditional techniques from a master weaver. Some were white women fascinated by the artistry and functionality of the baskets. Some were children of mixed heritage like Sam and Mary, seeking to connect with the Apache part of their identity. Thomas found deep satisfaction in watching his wife share her knowledge so freely. She was a patient, encouraging teacher, just as she had been with him all those years ago. And he often joined the classes, both to continue improving his own skills and to serve as a living example that these techniques were not just for one people, but for anyone willing to learn with respect and dedication. Sam, now 16, had become Thomas's right hand in managing the ranch operations. The boy had inherited his father's work ethic and his mother's attention to detail, and he moved between the white ranching world and the Apache community with an ease that made Thomas proud. Sam was also courting a young woman from town, the daughter of the blacksmith, and Thomas saw in their relationship echoes of his own courtship of Aiyana. Two young people from different backgrounds finding common ground in respect and affection. Mary, 14, had developed into a remarkable artist. Her sketches and paintings depicted scenes from both Apache and white life, and she had a particular talent for capturing the beauty of everyday moments. Her mother weaving, her father working with horses, children playing, elders telling stories. A gallery owner from Tucson had expressed interest in displaying her work, and Thomas and Aiyana were carefully considering whether to encourage this opportunity. In the autumn of 1892, Nasha passed away peacefully in her sleep at the remarkable age of 87. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people. Apache families who had treasured her teachings, white families who had bought her baskets, students she had influenced, grandchildren and great-grandchildren she had loved. Aiyana wept as they buried her grandmother with some of her finest baskets, but there was joy mixed with the grief, a celebration of a life fully lived and a legacy that would endure. She told me once that she would live long enough to see her teachings survive into the next generation, Aiyana said as they stood by the grave. She said as long as someone was still weaving the water baskets, as long as the patterns were being passed down, she could rest easy. She saw you learning, saw our children learning, saw all those students in our workshop. She knew the knowledge would survive. Thomas held his wife close, providing what comfort he could. She was an extraordinary woman. And she lives on in you, in Sam and Mary, in every basket woven using the techniques she preserved. She achieved something most people can only dream of, true immortality through the skills and knowledge she passed along. That winter, Thomas and Aiyana began collaborating on something new, a book documenting Apache basket weaving techniques. Mary provided the illustrations, carefully sketching each step of various patterns. Aiyana wrote descriptions in both English and Apache, explaining not just the how but the why of each technique. Thomas helped organize and edit, drawing on his experience teaching beginners to ensure the instructions were clear. It was painstaking work, requiring months of effort, but they all understood its importance. Nasha had preserved the knowledge by teaching, but a book would preserve it even further, making it accessible to people who might never have the chance to learn from a master weaver in person. The book was published in the summer of 1893 through a small press in Tucson, and it was immediately popular. Libraries ordered copies. Teachers used it in schools. Individual weavers treasured it as a reference guide. And most importantly, it helped ensure that the ancient techniques would not be lost, even as the world continued to change in ways that threatened traditional knowledge. Sam married his sweetheart, Elizabeth, in the spring of 1894. The wedding blended traditions just as Thomas and Aiyana's had, and watching his son pledge his love to his chosen woman, Thomas felt a profound sense of continuity. Sam and Elizabeth built a small house on the property, and Sam continued working with his father while Elizabeth learned weaving from Aiyana, creating another generation that valued both practical ranching skills and traditional crafts. Mary, meanwhile, had her first art exhibition in Tucson in 1895, and it was a tremendous success. Her paintings sold quickly, and several wealthy patrons commissioned works. But Mary chose to stay close to home, building a studio on the property where she could create her art while remaining part of the family enterprise. On a warm evening in the summer of 1896, 20 years after that first meeting by the creek, Thomas and Aiyana sat on the porch of their home watching the sun set. They were surrounded by 3 generations now: Sam and Elizabeth with their infant son, Mary sketching the sunset, Aiyana's younger siblings visiting with their children, friends from both communities gathered for a casual meal. "This is what we built," Aiyana said softly, gesturing at the scene before them. "Not just a house or a ranch or even a family, a community where different worlds meet and create something new." Thomas nodded, his arm around his wife's shoulders. "And it all started because I stopped to watch you weave. Because you were patient enough to teach a stubborn cowboy who knew nothing about baskets. Because we were both willing to look past the obvious differences to the deeper connections. You still weave." Asked one of the visiting children, a boy of about 8 who was fascinated by the baskets displayed throughout the house. Thomas smiled. "Every week. Would you like to see?" The boy nodded enthusiastically, and soon Thomas was in the workshop showing him the basics of the spiral start, just as Aiyana had shown Thomas 2 decades earlier. The boy's fingers were clumsy and his tension was uneven, but his enthusiasm was genuine, and Thomas felt the satisfaction of passing knowledge to yet another generation. Aiyana joined them, bringing willow strips she had prepared earlier. She knelt beside the boy, her hands guiding his just as her grandmother's hands had once guided hers, and Thomas watched the 3 of them together and felt complete. Later that night, after all the visitors had left and the house was quiet, Thomas worked on a basket in the lamplight. It was going to be a gift for his grandson, a water basket woven with the blessing pattern Nasha had taught him so long ago. His fingers moved with practiced ease now, the pattern so familiar they required little conscious thought. The willow bent smoothly under his hands, finding its place in the spiral with satisfying precision. Aiyana watched him work with the same expression she had worn all those years ago by the creek: concentration, appreciation, and something deeper that might have been love. "You have become a true basket weaver," she said. "Not just someone who knows the techniques, but someone who understands the spirit of the craft." Thomas looked up from his work and smiled. "I had the best teacher and the best reason to learn. Everything good in my life traces back to that morning I saw you sitting by the creek, creating magic with your hands. I marvel at your skill still, Aiyana. I marvel at your skill always." She came and sat beside him, picking up her own work. They wove together in comfortable silence, their hands moving in parallel rhythms, creating beauty from simple materials, just as they had created their life together from 2 different worlds. The baskets they made would hold water without leaking, would last for generations, would carry forward the knowledge and love that had shaped them. Outside, the creek flowed as it always had, its water constant and renewing. The land stretched out around their home, wild and beautiful and full of possibility. The stars wheeled overhead in their eternal patterns, indifferent to human concerns but somehow witness to human joys. Thomas and Aiyana wove their baskets and built their life, and both were strong and beautiful and made to last. The cowboy had learned to create as well as to labor, to preserve as well as to build. The weaver had learned to teach as well as to craft, to share her knowledge beyond the boundaries of her people. Together they had proven that love could bridge any divide, that respect could overcome any prejudice, that patience and dedication could create something lasting and good. Their children would carry these lessons forward and their children's children after them. The baskets would remain, holding water without leaking, testimony to skill passed down through generations. The stories would remain, told and retold around family fires. The land would remain, cared for by people who valued both tradition and progress, both the old ways and the new. And in the heart of it all was the simple truth that had brought them together. She was weaving baskets that held water without leaking, and the cowboy marveled at her skill. He had marveled then, he marveled now, and he would marvel always for as long as his life lasted. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The years continued to unfold in their beautiful pattern. Thomas and Aiyana grew older together, their hair turning silver but their love remaining as vibrant as ever. They saw their grandchildren grow and begin learning the weaving craft, saw the ranch prosper, saw their community become a model for how different cultures could coexist respectfully. Thomas never forgot the gift Aiyana had given him that first morning by the creek. The gift of seeing beauty in unexpected places, of valuing skills beyond his own culture, of understanding that there were many ways to measure a life's worth. He had come west searching for purpose, and had found it in willow branches and patient hands, in a woman who saw past his rough exterior to the heart underneath. And Aiyana never forgot the gift Thomas had given her, the gift of being seen truly, of having her skills valued not just by her own people, but by an outsider willing to learn, of proving that love could transcend the boundaries others insisted were insurmountable. She had expected to live a traditional Apache life, and instead had helped create something new and valuable, a bridge between worlds that would stand long after she was gone. On their 25th wedding anniversary in 1901, their children organized a celebration that brought together everyone whose lives they had touched. There were speeches and songs, food from both traditions, and a display of baskets that included Aiyana's masterworks, Nasha's legacy pieces, Thomas's honest efforts, and the learning attempts of 3 generations of students. But the moment Thomas treasured most came late in the evening when he and Aiyana slipped away to walk down to the creek where they had first met. The moon was full, casting silver light on the water, and they sat on the bank just as they had 25 years before, though now as husband and wife, partners in all things, 2 lives woven together as tightly as the finest basket. "If I could go back and tell my younger self what was coming," Thomas said, "I am not sure I would believe it. All of this, everything we have built, it exceeded my wildest dreams." Aiyana leaned her head on his shoulder. "I would tell my younger self to trust the spirits. They knew what they were doing when they brought you past this creek on that particular morning. They knew we needed each other." "I needed you more," Thomas said. "We needed each other equally," Aiyana corrected. "And we still do. We will always need each other." They sat together as the moon tracked across the sky and the creek sang its eternal song. 2 people from different worlds who had created their own world together, populated by love and respect and baskets that held water without leaking, without ever letting a single drop escape. Their life had been woven strand by strand, pattern by pattern, day by day, and the result was strong and beautiful and built to last. Thomas took Aiyana's hand, feeling the calluses earned from a lifetime of weaving, and he marveled as he always had, as he always would. She was weaving baskets that held water without leaking. The cowboy marveled at her skill always. It was a simple truth, but it contained everything that mattered: admiration, respect, love, and the willingness to learn from each other that had made all the rest possible. They walked back to their home hand in hand, to the family and friends and life they had built together. Behind them the creek flowed on, and ahead of them stretched whatever years remained, to be woven together with the same care and skill that had shaped the decades already past. It was a good life, an honest life, a life that honored both their traditions while creating something new. And every basket they wove, every student they taught, every moment they shared was proof that love truly could overcome any obstacle, if 2 people were willing to work at it with patience, respect, and dedication to creating something beautiful that would last. The story of Thomas and Aiyana became legend in their corner of Arizona territory. People spoke of the cowboy who learned to weave and the Apache woman who taught him, and how their love had created ripples that spread far beyond themselves. The baskets remained long after they were gone, holding water without leaking, each one a small monument to skill and patience and the beautiful things that can happen when people look past differences to see the humanity underneath. But that was all still in the future. On this night, their 25th anniversary, Thomas and Aiyana simply held each other close and gave thanks for the gift of having found each other, for the life they had woven together, for the knowledge that true love, once found, could endure anything. She was weaving baskets that held water without leaking, and the cowboy marveled at her skill always, and that simple act of admiration and respect had been the foundation for everything else. Marriage, family, community, legacy, love. It was enough. It had always been enough. And it would remain enough for all the years to come. A testament to the truth that the greatest adventures often begin with the simple act of stopping to appreciate beauty when you find it, and the courage to reach across, divides to connect with someone who seems different but is, in all the ways that matter, exactly what you need. Their story ended not with drama but with contentment, not with conflict but with peace, not with separation but with togetherness.